Okay, well, it's a couple of minutes after 7, so I think we will give it a go. Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome. My name is Sharon Murphy. I'm from Carrickfergus Museum. Thank you for joining us on what I know will be a very poignant and compelling session with Lead the Way tour guide Adrian Hack. Adrian has had a long interest in the Second World War, and he first developed his tour about 2.5 years ago, which of course specialises in the activities that happened in Carrick during that period. We're delighted to have Adrian on board for our project, Looking Back to Look Forward, which is a Northern Ireland Centenary project funded by the National Lottery Fund through their Shared History Fund. So our Museum and Heritage team across Carrickfergus, Larne and Ballymena are delivering this project on behalf of Mid and East Antrim Borough Council as part of their Northern Ireland Centenary plans this year. And the purpose of the project is to look at the lived experience in the Mid and East Antrim area from 1921 to the present day. So we are looking to understand who we were, who we are, and look at some of the events that shaped our area. And we're hoping to uncover previously untold stories. The project itself has a number of themes, but of course World War II is particularly interesting to look at. As we'll hear from Adrian, the war affected everyone, and most people contributed to the war effort in some capacity, either military or through civilian service. I'm going to hand over to Adrian in a moment. Of course, this is a brave new world for us. Normally, Adrian would be walking us around the town, but he has put together a special presentation for us tonight, which allows us to enjoy his tour from the comfort of your own living room. So no sore feet to worry about, and no weather to worry about as well. Now, before we get started, I have to tell you a couple of things. Number one, this session is being recorded, and that is so we can put it out online at a later date. We will be putting that out through our Heritage Carrickfergus Facebook page shortly. And also, when the session has finished, we will be launching a survey which should pop up on your screen. So if you wouldn't mind filling that in order for us to get some feedback, we'd really appreciate that. Thank you. And of course, we will be taking questions. We'll be taking questions at the end. And for that, could I ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So throughout the presentation, you can just type your questions in there. I'll see them on the screen. And then when we're finished, I'll field them to Adrian. So keep that in mind and get thinking of questions to test him, maybe. Now, Adrian's going to be referring to a number of resources which have been helpful in his research, including museum resources. Which brings me to our ulterior motive for this evening. We are actually looking to recruit a few volunteers who would be interested in participating in our community research programme to try and reveal some more of these untold stories. But don't let that put you off. For now, let's just take in the stories that Adrian has already uncovered for us. So Adrian, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Sharon. Hopefully we can see me because I'm very new to delivering on Zoom, so I can't see what you see, so I just hope things are working out. And in a few minutes, I have learned that by switching video cameras off, it increases the strength of the internet connection stuff, so in a couple of minutes I'll knock that off. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this project. As you had said, I'm very, very passionate about the Second World War period, and I'm very, very passionate about my hometown of Carrickfergus. And I've been doing these tours now for about 2.5 years, apart from the long COVID-enforced pause that we've just had. My tours normally take between 1.2 and 2.5 miles to get round. But thanks to technology, today we're going to cover about 5 miles in hopefully around about 45 minutes. So there's no need to worry about social distancing, sanitizing, face coverings, or sore feet. You can do all of this just sitting watching the TV screen. So I'm just going to get onto the first set of slides in, and I'll knock my video off for signal strength. Hold on. There we go. Hope everybody can hear that now. The reason I start taking these tours around Carrickfergus, hang on a wee second, sorry. There we go. That's better. The reason I start taking these tours around was actually to keep the memories of this period alive. One of the most momentous periods of the 20th century. And I just think that the role that Northern Ireland, and in my case, obviously, Carrickfergus played during the Second World War, is something that's largely overlooked. I also know that I haven't uncovered everything that was happening at that time during the Second World War, which is why I'm supportive of this project. And I hope that we'll get some more stories and memorabilia and stuff by the time we get to the end. This is just by way of a snapshot of what I normally cover, because time's quite limited. First of all, a little bit of background. From the mid-1930s on, war with Nazi Germany looked like it was likely. By 1938, it seemed inevitable. And then, as everybody huddled round their wirelesses in their living rooms and listened to BBC News, at 11 o'clock on Sunday, the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation with his very final comment you can see at the bottom, but consequently this country is at war with Germany. And it's hard to imagine actually how that would have felt to people in Carrickfergus and beyond hearing those immortal words. The very next day, Belfast Telegraph, a couple of the articles I got from the British Newspaper Archive, really shows how quickly things were going to change. We have advertisements for tenders for air raid shelters. I noticed that cinemas and theatres were not yet due to close, despite people thinking it would do. And on the right-hand side, English professional football suspended with immediate effect, players' contracts cancelled, and basically that was the end of football. And the Irish League over here followed suit fairly quickly afterwards. This is really the story of Carrickfergus and how it reacted to wartime conditions. Here's a photo of Carrickfergus taken in 1948, 3 years after the war ended. I'll be using close-ups of this photo throughout the tour to help show how the town looked during the war. And at the outbreak of war, Carrickfergus only had a population of 4,500, and then most of those residents lived on the coastal side of the railway line. If you're looking at the top of the photograph, you can nearly see a straight line about a fifth of the way down. That's the railway line. Most people would have lived below that on the coastal side. On the countryside of the railway line, where there are a few houses now, but that wasn't there as when the war broke out, was mainly open fields and a few factories. And for this virtual tour, we're going to visit 12 separate locations, which will help tell the story of Carrick during the Second World War. 8 of those locations are usually part of my walking tour, but thanks to Zoom and technology, I'm able to go a bit further outside the town and take in 4 extra steps. Now, if anybody ever wants to physically do that length of a walk with me, they're more than welcome if their fitness tracker needs the steps up, but it's a brave old walk. I always start my tours from Carrickfergus Castle. It's the obvious place really to start, as the castle is by far the easiest place for visitors to towns or even locals to find me. If you can't find the castle, there's no point coming on the tour. Built in the 12th century, the castle established this area as a military strong point. Carrickfergus remained really a garrison town right up until 1928, when the town itself was demilitarised and the castle became a national monument and visitor attraction, which it still is today. As you can see from this photo, the harbour car park is still a harbour at this stage, and the main highway not yet considered. Although the castle wasn't put to strict military use during the war, other than to act possibly as a storeroom, it was an important part of civilian protection. Some of its rooms were fitted with ventilation systems and designated as air raid shelters. And the main parade ground, you can see in this arrow, a few shelters were actually built to a side wall. On the raised platform to the right-hand side of the arrow, soil was brought in, and the terrace actually became a vegetable garden to produce food. And we'll return to the castle later on in the tour. So we're going to start walking now, but obviously digitally. Across the main highway, dander along High Street until we reach the town hall. And this is how the town hall would have looked during war times. And it's how the residents of Carrickfergus would have seen their town. And you can see just how tightly packed and dense the housing is. Where now we have shops or empty spaces, you can see that they tended to be 2- and 3-story buildings for accommodation. The town hall was a key location for the local population during the war. It was a dispersal site for civilian respirators just before war broke out. This is a photograph taken inside the town hall's main hall. Notice the number of local government administrators and volunteers from the British Red Cross. They're all there helping folk get the correct masks and being shown how to put them on. A newspaper report from the time says that the town hall distributed around 10,000 gas masks. That was to civilians from within the town, but also those from Green Island, Whitehead, and the surrounding countryside. And there were sort of 3 types of respirators or gas masks that were issued. Top left there we have ones for adults, which came in various sizes depending on the size of your head. The red one in the middle there was for younger children, designed by Walt Disney and actually named the Mickey Mouse mask. It had a rubber flap you can see in the centre of the front there that made a raspberry noise as children breathed out to try and keep it sort of light-hearted. And the aim was to make the wearing of the mask less frightening for the child. And finally, on the bottom right there, you can see a full body respirator for infants, which looks quite scary. The baby would be placed inside this contraption, but as their lungs were too weak to draw air through the filter, an adult had to continually pump, as you can see on the right-hand side there, pump the respirator. Quite a frightening ordeal, I would think, for everybody involved. Civilians also had to get used to other administrative things like rationing for food, fuel, clothes. Identity cards were required. If you were travelling outside Northern Ireland, you had to get a permit. And there were opportunities then also given to join civil defence or voluntary services. I will cover a bit of that later on. But these are some of the documents from the museum's archives relating to what civilians would have had about their person. Quite interesting. And of course, the war eventually did come to an end in 1945, and the town hall played a time there of signalling better times ahead by hosting a VE dance, Victory in Europe dance. The gentleman at the bottom front there looks as if he's lost his partner. Rumours are always there that the Americans stole our women, but I think by that stage most Americans had left Northern Ireland. We'll leave the dancers to it and make our way slowly to the next stop. A short stroll along Joymount brings us to what was the site of the Albion clothing factory. It's now a housing development. As men volunteered for service in the armed forces, the merchant navy, or worked in vital occupations, women became an invaluable asset to the war effort. Thousands took up employment in local factories. The Albion was one such factory that changed from civilian to military work, from making clothes to making uniforms. Now here's a photo taken in the early 1950s, which shows the Albion factory. You can see that big long oval-shaped building there. On the top right, you can see the early houses of the Sunnylands estate, which were built immediately after the war. But during the war, that area where the Sunnylands estate is served another purpose. And again, we'll come on to that shortly, just teasing you with that photograph. Here we have a photo of the workers from the Albion factory taken just 2 years before war was declared. It's highly likely that most of these workers would have remained employed here during the war. I've highlighted the factory's manageress, Miss Frances Carnahan. I only began to discover her story over the last few weeks. Miss Carnahan played a very important role in the voluntary capacity during the war. She established a Red Cross team from her team of girls. When gas masks were first issued, she asked her workers to do a full shift while wearing them to try and help them get used to the feel of them. She regularly brought in speakers from the likes of the Air Raid Precautions team to reinforce the importance of protecting everyone before, during, and after a raid. Some of her girls were actually trained help out in the event of an air raid with casualties afterwards. And we see Miss Carnahan again in this photograph from the museum archives. These are some of the local women who took up voluntary roles during the war. Things like the Women's Voluntary Service, British Red Cross, fundraising committees, that sort of thing. And at that time, most people, as well as having a job to do or families to bring up, were conscious that their efforts were required in a broader capacity against these organisations. So we'll leave the Albion behind, walk along McKean's Avenue, up over the Horseshoe Railway Bridge, past the health centre and Carrick Rangers football ground, and we soon arrive at Barn Mills. Although now an apartment complex, Barn Mills was actually built in the late 1790s as a cotton mill, and then it converted to process linen as linen became a big industry in Ireland. This photo is from the late 1930s, so it's exactly what the factory area would have looked like at the outbreak of war. Notice how it's surrounded by fields rather than the houses that are around it today. After a few years of the war breaking out, it was actually taken over by the Littlewood Company, who were based originally in the north of England and did a lot of manufacturing for clothing. They're also actually the company behind Littlewood's Pools, if anybody can remember that competition from years back. But it changed to make something that was required for the war effort. Its main product was parachutes. At the time of conversion, it was actually the largest parachute factory in the world, employing around 1,000 people, mainly women. And you can see here a photograph taken inside the factory of a woman putting the final part of the parachute together. On a smaller scale, the factory also produced Mae West life jackets. And this photograph again is taken outside Barn Mills factory. I'll not say why it was called Mae West in case there are any younger viewers, but they can look it up. The factory also made these things here, these unusual things called para-dummies. And these were 3 feet long, basically Hessian dolls filled with sand and sawdust. They looked like a scaled down parachute was attached and small explosives were tied to the arms and legs. These were dropped from an aircraft at dawn, and their silhouette mimicked that of paratroopers, especially to fool troops on the ground and thinking there was an attack imminent. So on D-Day, for example, before the landings on the beaches, aircraft dropped these para-dummies inland into forests, and the explosives that were attached to them detonated on contact with the ground, but not in an attempt to kill or maim. They were there to sound like grenades and add to the deception and draw troops away from the beaches. And it was a fairly successful attack. And as a wee aside, and people who've been on my tour will know this is my favourite photograph of all, is that very pretty young woman at the front on the left-hand side, my mother-in-law. And we only found this photograph 3 years ago, but sadly she passed away 10, and I never got a chance to talk to her about her experiences of making these para-dummies. It was the importance, I think, of talking to people before they go. So we'll head on from Barn Mills, and this is a fairly long walk uphill, following almost the path of the Solatober River, onto the top road, as we call it, and we arrive at an area called Solatober. And this is where the town's recycling centre is located, along with the builders, merchants, and the cafe. And you may recognise this building as the cafe. When this photograph was taken, this was actually a military prison and detention centre, but not for prisoners of war, but where soldiers and sailors who had been court-martialed were held and detained. And this is the view from the inside. This is what the prisoners would have seen. On the left is where their clothes, because they still would have had a form of uniform, would have been supplied and stored. And the right-hand side is really their laundry, where they would have come and cleaned their clothes and washed themselves. Despite being prisoners, these men were still part of the armed forces. At the end of their custodial sentence, they would be expected to return into service. And as a result, they still had to take part in daily drills in the fields below the detention centre. And this is taken then from in behind where our current recycling centre is. And in order to keep fit, they were also put through this assault course, and you can just about make out the lumps and bumps and ropes, slightly out of focus, but that's just because of the size of the photograph. And the old chimney you see in the middle of this photo is still there today, though it's covered in ivy. And this is the long bit now, all the way across the middle road, and then turning left down Prospect Road until we arrive at the Henley Gate, the old entrance to the old Prospect estate before it was a housing development. From 1942 to 1944, the Prospect estate was primarily used by the American Army as a temporary camp. But in early 1945, young Belgian men who'd been liberated by the Allies came to Northern Ireland in preparation to form a new Belgian army. Here we have some stuff from the museum archives again. Invitation to a dinner dance and a couple of those Belgian soldiers. There was the Rumbeke, I hope I pronounced that right, brigade, who were stationed in Carrickfergus, with the majority in Prospect and a few in Sunnylands. The men arrived here originally with just the clothes they had on their backs, many without footwear, as the uniforms didn't arrive for a few months. Local people, though, saw the fate of these young men coming on land and donated clothes, boots and food to the new arrivals. And you can see the importance of the Irish connection to this Belgian regiment by the fact it has the shamrock on their official badge. And you can also see how important this was to the people of Belgium, as the 50th anniversary of the Belgian Army being formed here in Northern Ireland was covered on a first day stamp cover. And other temporary visitors to Carrickfergus also stayed, we think, in Prospect. They weren't here by choice. Prospect was used as an overspill detention centre for German and Italian prisoners of war when the main prisoner of war camps became too full. And the museum lent me this very, very recently, a fantastic photograph, even if it's slightly out of focus, of prisoners of war being marched through the Minorca area of Carrickfergus. It's an area of the town's history that I'm not that familiar with and would love to hear more about, with the prisoners of war. So we'll take a short detour from Henley Gate, move up the Woodburn Road, just to where there's now the church, and on the left-hand side there's a wee laneway. The church actually is the site of the Woodburn Weaving Company, used to make webbing for soldiers. Now, webbing is not like you have for Spider-Man. Webbing for soldiers was really the belts and straps that they used to attach equipment to the uniform. On the other side of the road then, where this last man on the marker is, down a laneway, there's actually an Ulster Home Guard store still in there. I'm not going to say too much about the Ulster Home Guard because it's a fantastically interesting story that I could talk about for an hour. But there's an excellent book available through the museum called Forgotten Service, the story of Green Island and Carrickfergus Home Guard by Sean McIntyre. And if nothing else, it completely dispels the bad army myth. It's well worth a read. The local Home Guard used Scout Bush House as its headquarters. And here's a photograph of it here, but it's long gone. And it was located in the field just behind the police stores at Sea Park. The foundations are still there in the field apparently, but the building itself is long gone. And here are some of that Home Guard battalion photographed outside the front of that Scout Bush House. And just before the Home Guard were disbanded in 1944, when it was pretty obvious the Germans were not going to be invading, they were allowed to parade through High Street. I think it's a fantastic photograph to give you an idea, first of all, of how young those soldiers look, which is nothing like Dad's army. And also, if you look how long that parade goes on down High Street. so many people took part and so many residents came out to thank them for their service. So continuing back down the Woodburn Road this time, so we're finally going downhill again. We'll head down the Woodburn Road and we arrive at an area which is between Carrick Rugby Club and the town's Royal Mail Sorting and Delivery Office. And this is how the area looked during the war, quite different to what it is today. Very little housing, and this temporary set of buildings you can see just off center arrow there, again, the oval shaped long sausage buildings. To put into context, I have to diverge a little bit from Carrickfergus. In the mid-1930s, Harlan Wolff in Belfast was involved in building tanks for the British Army. Top left, we can see A9 cruisers being assembled. On the right, Archer Matilda IIs and Churchill tanks outside of Harlan Wolff workshop in Belfast. Harlan Wolff also won a contract to build prototype new infantry tank called the A20. However, by the time 4 of these rolled off the production line in the spring of 1940, they were already obsolete. But all was not lost. The Vauxhall Group in London, now more famous for cars, but then heavily involved in munitions, took the prototype, improved it, and created a tank called the A22, which became better known as the Churchill. In spring of 1941, however, the German Luftwaffe launched a series of bombing raids on Belfast. These raids became known as the Belfast Blitz. As well as the horrific civilian casualties, with almost 1,000 killed, the Docks area was badly hit. Harlan Wolff took the decision to relocate its tank production outside of the city and chose a site in Carrickfergus. And that's what those temporary buildings in the earlier photograph were, a tank factory that was built from scratch in 5 weeks. The Carrickfergus factory continued building those Matilda IIs. These are photographs of what it's like to build inside a tank factory, these Matildas, but it's not taken from Carrickfergus. I don't have any from inside the factory, unfortunately. But this one was taken at Carrickfergus. In early 1944, 75 of these A27 Centaurs were built. These were designed specifically as an assault vehicle, whereas the Churchill tanks was to support infantry. These Centaurs were designed to be far more aggressive and work as a tank to attack other tanks or heavily defended positions. And you get a good sense of those temporary buildings that we saw at a distance now close up in this photograph. And while we're still here, across the road from the tank factory, there was a sports field, originally for football, and now currently used, obviously, for rugby, being Carrickfergus Rugby Club. But in spring 1942, it hosted the first ever baseball match in Northern Ireland between 2 United States Army units who were stationed in Carrickfergus. And here we have a few newspaper clippings, advertise that game, and then gives you a very brief match report. Quite interesting for the locals, I would have assumed. So we'll leave Woodburn, walk down slightly, and then follow the road or the footpath alongside the railway lines. And we finally arrive at Sunnylands. And this is where I live, not far from here. This area was a British Army camp from before the First World War until it was decommissioned in 1927. From then until 1939, although most of the buildings had been sold off to local farmers to become hay sheds and chicken coops, the site was used by Boy Scouts for their annual summer camp from all of Ireland. But in 1939, once war was declared, the camp was reactivated. And remember, said at the outset, these photographs were taken from 1948. Much of the camp by now has been demolished to make room for Fergus Court there. You can see being built just centre left. But centre right, just where the arrow is, there were still some remnants of how the army camp would have looked. And those regular black oval missing huts would have run from there to almost Clipperstown on the other side and could have housed up to 1,000 soldiers at any one time. The 1st Battalion, 5th Leicestershire Regiment were based there originally. They were the English ones who moved there in 1939, up until February 1942, when the camp was officially handed over to the United States Army, just a few days after the US Army had first arrived in Northern Ireland. And these photographs capture that handover, where we see Leicestershire cooks on the left, showing American counterparts how to make a proper cup of tea. And a couple of weeks later, the most senior American officer in Northern Ireland, Major General Hartle, and Senator Winant expected the accommodation at Sunnylands. Hartle is the man in the middle, and Winant is the non-military looking man at the front. And he was one of the senators in charge of the War Department in America. The first US Army unit to actually be stationed here was the 63rd Signals, and you can see them here enjoying our lovely Northern Irish weather. Not much sign of any grass in there, but in the background you can then see those rows upon rows of those Nissen huts. But most famously, Sunnylands was chosen as the camp to be used in the formation of a new American commando-style fighting unit, the US Rangers. Their leader was William Orlando Darby, who became one of the United States' most respected senior officers before his untimely death on active duty on the front line in Italy, just a few days before the war ended. Darby's selection process at Sunnylands was tough. From 1,500 volunteers to join the new unit, only 550 passed the physical tests required. And key to this selection process was the speed march. Volunteers had to complete a march each day in full kit, including backpack. The first march was 5 miles to be completed in 1 hour, and this built gradually over a period of 2.5 weeks, to a final march of 12 miles in 2 hours. Any soldier who failed to complete any of those speed marches on time were sent back to their original unit. Now, this photograph was taken a few weeks after the Rangers left Carrickfergus to begin training at Commando School in Achnacarry in Scotland, but it gives an idea of what residents in Carrickfergus may have seen in June 1942 during one of those speed marches. Physical fitness and bravery were key components for any Ranger. As you can see from the photo on the left, it takes some guts to jump from the top of that into a pile of mud. As an interesting aside, when British commandos went through this exercise, the instructor at the bottom, who is indeed a British commando, told the troops to climb to the top and then drop down the other side. But there was a bit of friction between the Americans and the British commandos in the early days because the Americans were new and the British commando instructors were a bit worried about these Americans taking up valuable time away from British soldiers. So for this particular exercise, the commando instructors told the Rangers a slightly different instruction. So instead of climb up and drop down, it was climb up and jump down. So US Rangers actually stood on that top bar before jumping down. But apparently it was by doing this exercise that they won the respect of their commando instructors. And the importance of those speed marches became apparent during the war. On the right-hand side, this is a photograph of the US Rangers in Tunisia, I think it is, on their way, marching across the hills to take on the enemy. And it wasn't unusual for Rangers' actions to be a case of drop 15 miles away from their target and then march those 15 miles before engaging the enemy, and if necessary, marching back again. But no need for a speed march for us. We're going to take a short walk back into the town centre and we'll arrive at the fire station. Well, it wasn't a fire station back during the war. From this arrow you can see the only fire that were interested in this area was that used to cook food. This was actually an American Army cookhouse, again using Nissen huts. And again you can see the dense housing around it as well. And a few hundred yards away from that cookhouse, behind the Orange Hall, which is it's just off centre, were some more Nissan huts for holding troops. And in both locations were African American servicemen. That's where they tended to be stationed. The US Army had a very strict segregation policy. Black soldiers could not serve in the same unit as other Americans. Often they were given menial jobs like cooks, laundry workers, or latrine diggers, digging toilets. They even had their own military police who were based in those huts behind the Orange Hall. When off duty, segregation was also rigidly enforced. There were no shared spaces in pubs, hotels, or restaurants. And it's reported that in Carrickfergus, the black servicemen would have gone to dances at churches rather than in pubs because they weren't allowed in. And hard to believe at this stage, even when you're talking about the mid-1940s here, even blood supplies were segregated along racial lines. So moving on then down towards the Irish Quarter, and we arrive at the Flame Gasworks. And again, look at that dense housing, and also in the background how close some of the factories were to where people lived. At this location, at the minute, is the only remaining public air raid shelter left from those that were built in the town. And there were three main ways to protect yourself and your family during an air raid. Up right, you would try and find yourself into a public air raid shelter, and this is what the inside of them would have looked like. Young schoolgirls with their gas masks and boxes. You could build yourself an Anderson shelter, which is at the bottom there if you were fortunate enough to have a back garden, and you would go in there. And if you didn't have a back garden, you would assemble, top left, a Morrison shelter, you'd lock yourself in at night and offer some protection. Although one additional protection that folks in Carrickfergus had is when you remember at the start I mentioned how many of them lived on the coastal side of the railway line, and then north of that there was very little housing, it was mainly open ground. Getting into open ground sometimes would have been a good protection as well. And fear of an air raid, though, was casually dismissed in the early years of the war. It was assumed that the German planes could not reach our shores. That obviously changed in spring 1941 with the Belfast Blitz I mentioned earlier on, and air raid precautions became even more important. Some of these artefacts from the museum collection relate to the air raid precautions and wardens of the time. A short trip then takes us down towards the harbour area, near Sainsbury's. During the war, this was an important petrol import and distribution centre. The storage tank you can see is still here in 1948. No supermarket there. Basically, empty petrol cans arrived by train on a rail line that no longer exists. And they were loaded onto a conveyor belt which took them into the processing plant. And I've highlighted in the top right, but I hope you can just about see it, is the keep of Carrickfergus Castle just in the background. Inside the plant, women from the Auxiliary Territorial Service, or the ATS, cleaned and repaired the cans. And these photographs are the ones that really bring home how women's roles changed during the war. They're now doing heavier work. Semi-automatic pumps would fill the refurbished cans with petrol, and then they were loaded back onto the rail trucks for distribution throughout Northern Ireland. And again, another one of my favourite photographs because it really shows concentration of the women, the machinery, but also the hairstyles of the day. Of course, with so much fuel about, there was always a risk of fire. Men from the ATS formed an army firefighting team, and they're seen here deploying a pump during a drill. For external fires, foam would have been pumped to the top of the main tank to quell the flames. I was quite surprised that I always imagined foam to be a modern phenomenon, but it's obviously been around for a lot longer. But more frightening, an internal fire would require work at much close quarters by men wearing asbestos suits. Our last few steps will take us full circle back to the castle. As mentioned at the start, the castle didn't really serve a strong military purpose during the war. It was, however, a popular attraction for visiting US servicemen. And this photograph was sent to me just before Christmas by the son of one of the men in this shot. These are men from a medical detachment stationed in North Down who visited the castle in 1943. And there are plenty of other photographs I've come across of American soldiers coming to visit our castle. And that really concludes the circular tour, the whistle-stop tour. There's so much more I could share with you, but time's against us. On the physical tour, as well as showing you some photographs, I'm able to show some of the artifacts that I've gathered over the last 2 years. In particular, I'd like to thank the Lottery Heritage Fund from Northern Ireland for helping me secure a few special items. On the left is one of those original baby's respirators, and on the right is an evacuee suitcase with a very well-loved penny, whose ear fell off 2 weeks ago, and I found in the back of my car and has been suitably glued back into place. And on the left here is one of those Mae West life jackets. I was able to order someone to make me a reproduction one. It's full size. And on the right, it's one of those parrot dummies, and again, a replica I got made, as was made in Barn Mills. And as I sort of draw this to a conclusion, I would love people to get involved in this project. I'm sure there are more and more stories still waiting to be discovered. I don't profess to know everything about my hometown during the Second World War. As United States Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld once said, there are known knowns, things that we know. There are known unknowns, things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns, things that we do not know we don't know. So on that note, I'd like to encourage you to join in with the research programme to help find those unknowns. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. And I'll hand back now to Sharon, who'll tell you a bit more about how to get involved.
Thank you, Adrian. Well done, particularly on that last slide. I was trying to read that out loud earlier on, and I struggled with it. An excellent quote. You know, even though you and I have been chatting about this for weeks, there was still parts of that I just didn't know. It is such a rich part of our history, and I really appreciate you taking the time to take us around that. I really felt like we were there, and hopefully we will be there one day. We are hoping for Adrian to do this tour in real life in August, when the NI 100 exhibition is in Carrick. Now, before I forget, Adrian, you mentioned Sean McIntyre's book, Forgotten Service, on the local Home Guard. So I just wanted to let people know that was a publication that was produced by the Carrickfergus and District Historical Society last year, and we hold copies at the museum. So as Adrian has put the contact details up there, so if you're interested in purchasing a copy, do drop us a line and we can organise payment and postage to you. And also Sean will be given a virtual talk for the Historical Society next month, so keep an eye out for that on our Facebook page, Heritage Carrickfergus. So Adrian, you know, we've talked about the community engagement project. I mean, we were saying there are some areas that we thought people might be interested in looking at more. Certainly some things that you're interested in looking at more. Some of the things we've talked about, for example, the prisoners of war. We don't really know a lot about them yet. Sure, we don't.
No, Sharon, you're quite right. I mean, I have different people tell me different things that they believe where the prisoners of war were kept.
Mm-hmm.
Hard to track down any official records, because although there were official prisoner of war camps in Northern Ireland, which are well documented, Carrickfergus is never actually listed as an official prisoner of war camp as such, because I think it was an overspill. So we probably would have had smaller groups. I've heard people say, yes, they were kept in Sunnylands, they were kept in Prospect, they were kept in that Milky prison up until October. I even heard people saying that's where they were put into the castle for, because there were foreigners put in it. No, I can't actually pin any of that down, so I'm hoping somebody can do that.
Yeah, that's
I'm
interesting.
also very keen. I'm just thinking now. Laura shared something with me again. It was around before Christmas time, and I've just to read out again. It was a sentence in a book. Basically said it's a book on the automotive history of Dublin, of all things. And it just mentioned that a company called McCairns, McCairns, McCairns of Dublin, a Vauxhall dealer during the war, were approached to come up north and help set up a factory that would build Bedford trucks, Bedford being part of the Vauxhall group. In that paragraph it said, so we moved to Carrickfergus and began training the locals. And that's all I have, is McCairns came up here, helped set up a factory that built trucks in Carrickfergus, and I'm at a complete dead end. So that's another one I would love people to, if they had anything at all, be fantastic.
Yeah, the other thing as well is the ARP and the civil defence in general. I mean, we have a couple of photos in the museum collection showing people that were in that. It would be nice to maybe uncover some stories, you know, if some people maybe had relatives that were in the civil defence. That would be interesting to find out as well, wouldn't
Absolutely it? Would, Sharon, because again, I think sometimes the role of civilians was downplayed during the Second World War. And I'm sure that there are somewhere in somebody's drawer cabinet or photo album, there might be photographs or medals or something to do about those civil defences. I think just over time, the bubbled at the surface. But I know from my own perspective, I mentioned to you before, I have my dad's service medal from being in the RAF. He never won anything for gallantry, but he was a good service medal. And it just sits in a drawer, and it's probably been there for 20 years. I'm exceptionally proud of it. But it's just in a drawer, and I would just like to think that maybe somebody else has stuff from Carrick with one of those voluntary organisations, just have to be a bit more depth to what we already know.
Well, this is why we're turning to you, the public. I hope you enjoyed that webinar, Adrian's talk. It was very interesting, and we would like to hear from you if you would like to take part in our research programme. Maybe you did have a relative that was involved in some industrial activity, worked in a factory. Maybe you'd like to know more about them. And if you would, we can help you do that. You're not going to be left to your own devices, and we'll support you in your research. We have a training webinar set up actually on the 25th of May on working with archives. And ultimately, we hope that any research that you might uncover, any stories that you uncover, can be incorporated into our project, into the exhibition and the learning resource, which we'll produce at the end of the project later in the year, and maybe even persuade a couple of people to take part in a wee film we're making. I'm definitely going to be looking at Adrian for that one, but we would love to hear from you if you'd like to get involved. The contact details are on the screen at the moment, so drop us a line, and Adrian and I will be in touch with you, and we can have a wee chat about your research idea and see how we can take it forward. So we have a couple of questions coming in. First of all, just a few, just thanking you for your presentation. Said it was great presentation, which it was indeed. Very good tour. Lots learned there. Jackie's asking, she's commenting on the assault course. And were any people really injured doing that? I'm sure there were.
I'm sure there were, but I don't think there'll be any official records to say that. But from any assault courts, you would get bumps and scratches and sprains and stuff. Thankfully, there was no live fire, unlike what our famous US Rangers had to go through, where some actually died in training.
Some of them did die in training, didn't they?
Yeah, there was an exercise, I think, around about Dundee that took part in live fire, and there was one killed and about 14 badly enough injured. They never returned to battle again. And that was just during their training. But I think up at that assault course, I think it was more about keeping fit and nimble than being as dangerous as the one that we saw the photograph of them, of the Rangers taking part in. So bumps and scratches, but I suspect nothing more.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Jackie was just taken with that photograph, because you know we look at that and think that is some height to be jumping from. I don't fancy that. The next one, I started reading it. I thought, oh, that sounds familiar. I know this story. This is from Ross Skelton, who wrote a very excellent book about growing up in the Lockview bungalows. Eden Halt, an excellent book. I highly recommend it. But Ross is commenting that he was born during those years in Sunnyland's house, where his grandfather was caretaker, and a bomb fell and killed a cow. Possibly the same bomb that landed at the station. So that's very interesting. Good to hear from you, Ross. And someone else is coming in, Rodney's. It's just again very, very interesting. And his father lived in Cheston Street during the war, and he told the story of seeing flares dropping on Carrick during the raid on Belfast, and being mesmerised and thinking it was fireworks. And talking about air raid shelters, which were in the castle. So definitely some interesting stories out there.
Yeah, it's just a matter of capturing them now and getting them recorded before it's too late. It would be even better if we had some first-hand accounts. I think it would be great if some of our more mature, well, exceptionally mature residents had some stories to share with us. And another part of it, obviously, then you mentioned there about the flares coming in the Belfast Blitz, is there are stories that instead of people running to air raid shelters, they actually ran to watch what was happening as some sort of almost a spectacle. But within a week or so of the Belfast Blitz in North Belfast, there's a newspaper article that says there were 800 people walked along the shore road to settle in Carrickfergus and be put into temporary accommodation, one of those spare Nissan huts, people's spare houses, church halls. And I'd be interested in finding out, is there anybody who remembers that episode of, I mean, I mentioned at the very start, a population of 4,500, suddenly having 800 new people arrive must have just been overwhelming for the town. And I would just love to find out how we coped and how we changed.
Yeah. But I don't think the air raid shelters at the castle, I mean, they converted a lot of space there, and they were described as the safest shelters in Northern Ireland, but I don't think they were actually used, as far as we know.
I think most of the air raid shelters probably were never used other than for a test run before the Belfast. Everybody knew what to do. But other than that, I mean, the Belfast Blitz only lasted 4 times in the space of about 3 weeks. So they weren't really used. But even trying to pin those locations, it would be interesting. From planning permission and stuff, we have rough areas. We know roughly where they are, but they were obviously knocked down. And as soon as they weren't needed, they were knocked back down again, bar that one in the flame work. So
yeah.
If anybody's any recollections of if people have recollections of, I don't know, playing in them or courting in them or whatever, or any photographs of them, would be absolutely fantastic.
And certainly memories of the Blitz, and going back to Sean's book, he has recorded first-hand accounts of people at Green Island watching the Blitz roaring over over Belfast, and some lovely illustrations drawn at the time. I say they're lovely.
Yeah.
Scary and poignant, but beautiful.
Yeah.
Adrian, I think people. Oh, there are more questions coming in.
Oh
no. Well, Jackie's asking just about the Rangers training from the Knocka for D-Day landings. I don't know if they went up as far as the Knocka, did they?
Could I just dispel that, Sharon? The Rangers who took part in D-Day were not the same Rangers that left Carrickfergus in 1942. The Rangers that were formed in Sunnyland were only in Carrickfergus for 3 weeks before going to Scotland for training. And their campaigns took them through. 50 of them took part in the Dieppe raid in August 42. And then November 42, they took part in Operation Torch, which brought them to Tunisia, across North Africa, into Sicily, and into Italy. So the Rangers who took part on D-Day were recruited and trained in America, brought to England, and took part in D-Day. They never came to Northern Ireland. So I have no doubt that there were possibly paratroopers who could have trained on the Knocker or in the Goblins. I've heard that as well out in the Goblins. But I would have severe doubts that they were US Rangers. I have no doubt it would have been US troops.
Yeah.
But I don't think they were US Rangers.
Yeah. But then that's where well, your tour is called Lead the Way, which is the Ranger motto, and that comes from the Normandy lands. Yeah, Rangers lead the way.
Yeah.
It's
quite an interesting story how they got that as well, about being on the beaches and being pinned down. And a senior general asking this group of fellas, what regiment are you from? And they said, we're from the Rangers. And that was his phrase, well then, Rangers lead the way. And that stuck with him ever since.
It's a great story. Jackie says she also spoke to a man who remembers going in the shelters in the castle as a child. So that would be interesting.
That would be interesting, yeah.
Indeed. And then Ross mentions a novel about Belfast in the war by Brian Moore, The Emperor of Ice Cream. Haven't come across that now.
I saw advertised actually recently during there was a Zoom presentation run by the Northern Ireland War Memorial, and I think that book was mentioned, so I'm on the lookout for it. If anybody has a copy they want to lend me, absolutely get in touch.
One for the reading list.
Yeah.
I'm just checking over this again just to make sure we haven't missed any. No, I think that's it for now.
That's great.
Well, sure, let's wrap it up there. Thanks again to everybody who has stayed on with us to the end. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative and interesting. And of course, we would love to hear from you if you would like to do a wee bit of research and help us with some more stories, and the contact details are on your screen. And when you sign off, hopefully you'll get a wee survey popping up, and if you wouldn't mind filling that in for us so we could get some feedback, it'd be very much appreciated. Thanks again to Adrian.
Thanks very much.
We'll chat soon. Yeah. And good night, everyone.
Bye.